History class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of the years 1920 to 45, and in the previous lectures we talked about some of the causes of the Great Depression, some of the worst features of the years 1929 to 32, and some of the failed policies of President Herbert Hoover as he attempted to unsuccessfully manage the Great Depression. And so now in this next series of lectures we turn to his successor, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who of course is regarded as one of our nation's greatest presidents, typically ranked up there in the top three, along with George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, and pick which one you want to put in the number one spot. But FDR, certainly well regarded and one of our greatest presidents. So in this first lecture, we're going to be talking a little bit about FDR's personal background and some of the qualities that influenced how he handled the presidency. As mentioned at the conclusion of the previous lecture, in 1933 FDR took office after winning a sweeping victory in the presidential election in 1932. And in his famous inaugural address, FDR told the nation, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." It was a message of hope and optimism which the nation hadn't heard before under Hoover. So even with his very first words, FDR revived a sense of hope in the country. And his early actions in office and the actions of his first term would do even more to set the nation on the road to recovery. So as we begin this discussion of Roosevelt and his presidency, I want to start by mentioning three important things that should probably be common knowledge amongst all Americans, but in case anyone has missed them, there are at least these three key facts that everyone needs to know about FDR if you want to understand FDR, the president. So one of them, of course, is that he was without the use of his legs throughout the time that he was president. He had been stricken with polio in 1921 while he was in his 30s. And while he did work to recover from that episode, he never regained the ability to walk again. And just from that initial thought, it's kind of hard to imagine a president today with a serious physical disability like that. And while it's a little bit outside of the realm of our discussion, Roosevelt and his managers throughout his presidency went to great lengths to conceal his disability from the public as much as one could. You see him in the picture on this screen riding in a car and shaking hands with a crowd. And they would often do that. He would ride in a car up to, sometimes even up onto the stage when making appearances. He often had his son or other people helping him as he walked to the podium. And then on the right you see the cartoon of Franklin running, and he's carrying a kite in the wind. But there were a lot of these kind of messages that he was physically robust and active and able. But more to the point regarding his illness and ailment and disability, it becomes a symbol of both his strength and his personality. Because while there was certainly a period of despair when he was initially stricken with the disease, he pretty quickly began to pull himself out of that sense of despair. He was convinced that he could beat the disease and that he would be able to walk again. And there are many stories, historians have uncovered lots of evidence of him working out furiously to try to recover the ability to walk. He went to the hot springs because he thought it might help his ailment. And there are descriptions of him at times literally dragging himself across the beach with his arms to try to build up strength in his legs. But also the profound suffering that he endured as he went through this process and this ailment made the challenges that confronted him in the White House, if not altogether easy, then at least manageable. And he would occasionally reflect that the suffering he went through while he was trying to recover from polio made everything else after that seem easy. And it's certainly reflected in the sense of action and activism and optimism and ebullience that we see reflected in the words of that inaugural address and really his actions throughout his presidency. The second thing that everyone should know about FDR is that he won the presidential election 4 times. And of course, he's the only president ever to do that for a number of different reasons, one of which was the precedent established by George Washington, our first president, who stepped down after his second term and opted not to run for a third. And so for the most part, the presidents prior to FDR followed that precedent and didn't run for a third term if they could have. And then, of course, after FDR, the law is changed in the 1950s to prevent a president from running for more than 2 terms. But I also think this points to what might seem an obvious fact, and that is that it's incredibly difficult to sustain the popularity long enough and well enough to win re-election 3 times after the initial election. When we look back over the presidents in our history, only a handful have served out a full second term, and of those, only a handful of others might have won a third election had they run, and certainly a fourth would have been in doubt. And so, while this is kind of a simple and obvious fact, it is a testament to the enormous and sustained and durable popularity of FDR throughout his presidency. And the final essential fact that I want to mention about FDR before we move on is the importance and significance of his wife, the First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who is enormously influential in her own right and transformed the role of the First Lady as no other First Lady had done up to that point. We will discuss at more detail a little bit later that before FDR became president, he had cheated on his wife Eleanor with her assistant, Lucy Mercer. This was, of course, a scarring event in their marriage, and at times the marriage itself seemed close to crumbling. They did, of course, remain together after that horrific trauma that their marriage endured. But after that event, the marriage was not so warm and tender, and in effect it became a partnership. They actually slept in different rooms. They kind of had their own wing in the White House while FDR was president. Eleanor was an activist as no other First Lady had been before that. She vigorously advocated for women's rights, for black rights, and assisted FDR in many different ways. And she herself was a very public figure. She went out across the country during the Great Depression, talking to people and reporting back to FDR. She was a voice in his ear, influencing him on many different issues. And people all across the country wrote thousands and thousands of letters to FDR, but also to Eleanor as well. She became an approachable figure for the American people. We'll talk more about Eleanor in the lectures to come. But for all of these 3 essential reasons, the presidency of FDR is unique and important, and we'll talk about how some of these factors shape his actions as President of the United States. Before we get to the presidency, I'm going to share a few elements of FDR's background and personal life and biography. I'll try to emphasize some things that influence him as president. Of course, there are endless details that we could bring up about FDR's life, but some of them aren't directly relevant to the conversation. Okay, so FDR was born in 1882 in Hyde Park, New York, born into a very wealthy and comfortable family and nurturing family. Hyde Park was one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the country. Franklin's father was a well-educated financier, and Franklin spent much of his youth living the life of a country squire, enjoying the outdoors and leisure activities, hunting and fishing. And as part of this experience, he learned to appreciate the outdoors and the ideas of conservation of nature, which we will discuss more about later when we talk about some of his New Deal policies. He also was raised under the very strong influence of his mother, Sarah Delano. He was an only child and thus was sheltered and nurtured, and she encouraged in him confidence and self-reliance. She taught him to hide any pain or suffering or sorrow that he might be undergoing. And of course, again, this plays a role in his attitude when he is president. He attended the Groton boarding school in New York, then went on to Harvard, then Columbia Law School. He was a mediocre student, but very active in activities and very popular as well. During this period, he also married Eleanor, who was a distant cousin to him. His political career followed a similar arc to his hero and distant relative, Theodore Roosevelt. Incidentally, he, of course, was related to Theodore, but on some level, FDR was related to 11 previous presidents. In 1910, he was elected to the New York State Senate, and while in that role, he fought against the infamous political politicians and machine politicians of New York. He supported farmers and workers and the common man. In 1913, he was appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Woodrow Wilson, again an office that Theodore had held previously. While in that role, he encouraged the expansion of the Navy and involvement in World War I. He actually wanted to serve in the military, but was denied, and so thus he would lead us during World War II without any actual combat experience. The steady progression in his political career was threatened by developments at home. First, in 1918, Eleanor discovered that Franklin had been engaging for some time in an affair with a woman named Lucy Mercer, who was actually an assistant for Eleanor. At first, she threatened divorce, but ultimately, Eleanor agreed to stay with Franklin. And as I mentioned previously, from that time on, their marriage was essentially a business partnership with little warmth and passion. And then secondly, in 1921, he was stricken with polio, again as I described previously. From 1921 to 24, he was away from politics to recover from polio. But he returned in 1924, giving a triumphant speech at the Democratic National Convention and announcing that he had returned to the political race. It seemed he was stronger than ever at that point, and his political career resumed. In 1928, he was elected governor of New York. And recall, this is the same election in which Hoover was elected President of the United States. So the two of them battled the Great Depression in their respective roles as perhaps the two most prominent executive officials in the country at that time. FDR established a reputation as a progressive reformer. He increased public works, backed reforms in agriculture and welfare, increased the regulation of utilities, and extended workmen's compensation. He also used the radio to promote his ideas, frequently giving speeches over the radio. As governor, he began to clarify his belief that the government was the protector of the people, not only militarily, but socially. The government should make sure that all citizens could earn a decent wage, secure medical care, and an education for their children. He initiated many reforms in New York that would later be a part of the New Deal, and a number of scholars have made the observation that as governor of New York, FDR was really practicing what would become a number of New Deal policies for the whole country as president. And of course, by 1932, he was ready to run for the presidency, which I discussed in some of the previous lectures. FDR wins one of the largest landslide victories in the election of 1932 that our nation had ever seen, sweeping Hoover away and dramatically announcing his presidency and our new leader during the Great Depression. So in the next lectures, we'll pick up with his policies and actions as president, starting with the first New Deal.